The light was a promise I renewed every 12 seconds. A sweep of white, a period of darkness, a sweep of white. It was the only conversation I held with the world, a monologue of vigilance broadcast into the indifferent churn of the Atlantic. My fortress was this pillar of stone and iron, rooted in granite, defiant against the water's constant rage. Here, inside the lantern room, the world was reduced to a predictable rhythm. The groan of the mechanism, the hiss of the lamp, the percussive slap of waves against the foundation far below. This was my code. A life measured in rotations, in polished brass and clean lenses. A life of containment. I had built these walls meticulously. Not just the physical ones of granite and brick, but the internal ones. The ones that kept the silence from becoming loneliness. Routine was my mortar. 6 o'clock, check the lamp. 8 o'clock, log the weather. 12 o'clock, midday meal, always the same. 18 o'clock, evening check. The hours were my sentries, each one standing guard against the chaos that lived just outside the glass and just behind my ribs. The sea could break ships, but it could not break my schedule. This was the lie I lived by, the lie that control was the same as peace. The storm arrived not with a roar, but with a sulking, bruised sky. The barometer had been plummeting for 2 days, a slow, deliberate descent into menace. The sea turned a sick, oily green-gray, the waves losing their rhythm, becoming chaotic and violent. I watched it from the gallery, the wind a physical thing, a solid wall of pressure that stole the breath from my lungs and tried to pry my fingers from the cold iron of the railing. This was the kind of storm that rewrote coastlines, that unearthed old wrecks and reminded men of their fragility. I was safe inside my tower. I was always safe. That was the point. Then I saw it. A dark slash against the churning foam. Too small for a trawler. Too desperate in its movements for anything that belonged out here. A small boat. A toy in a titan's bath, being brutalized by the waves. My duty was clear. A paragraph in a manual I had memorized years ago. In the event of a vessel in distress, the keeper is to render all possible aid. It was a rule, a simple, impersonal instruction. It had nothing to do with compassion. It was just another part of the mechanism. I tracked it through the binoculars, my hands steady despite the tremor that started deep in my gut. The boat was thrown, spun, and finally, mercifully, driven toward the rocky cove at the base of the lighthouse island. A place that offered the barest sliver of shelter. A place where a man might be dashed to pieces, or might just survive. I saw a figure, a flash of dark clothing, scrambling onto the rocks as the boat was devoured by the surf, splintering against the granite with a sound the wind stole before it could reach me. The man was alive. He was a problem, an intrusion, a violation of the sterile, predictable world I had curated. I followed the regulations. I descended the winding stairs, the stone cold and damp against my palm. I pulled on my oilskins, the thick, stiff fabric of familiar armor. I lit the hurricane lamp, its small, steady flame a miniature of the great one burning far above. The wind shrieked at the heavy oak door as I fought it open, a physical assault of salt spray and fury. The rule required me to act, so I acted. I would bring him in, give him shelter until the storm passed, and then he would be gone. An anomaly, contained and then expelled. My world would return to its perfect, silent rotation. He was huddled in the lee of a massive boulder, looking impossibly small against the vast, screaming chaos of the storm. His clothes were soaked through, plastered to his frame. When the lamplight fell on him, he looked up, and I saw his face for the first time. It wasn't the face of a hardened fisherman I might have expected. It was young, pale, framed by a mess of dark, wet hair. But it was his eyes that caught me. They were wide, not just with fear, but with a kind of stunned exhaustion, as if he'd been fighting this battle for a very long time. He carried one thing, clutched to his chest like a child. A long, dark case, battered and scarred by the sea. "The light," he managed to say, his voice a raw rasp, barely audible over the gale. "I saw the light." I just nodded, not trusting my own voice. Words were foreign currency here. I gestured with the lamp, a curt jerk of my head, leading him back toward the tower. He stumbled after me, a shadow clinging to my small circle of light. He was the world invading my fortress, and I was the one who had unlocked the gate. The sea roared its approval behind us. The door boomed shut, cutting off the storm's scream with a sudden, deafening finality. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was heavier, more profound than the usual quiet of the tower. It was a pressurized silence, thick with the sound of our breathing and the frantic drumming of rain against the thick stone. He stood there, dripping onto the flagstones of the entrance hall, a puddle forming at his feet. He was shivering, a fine, violent tremor that shook his entire body. His gaze darted around the space, the curving stone walls, the worn wooden crate that served as a bench, the bottom of the spiral staircase ascending into darkness. It was like watching a wild thing, suddenly caged. "I am Theodore." That is what I should have said. Offer a name, a human connection. But the words wouldn't form. They were rusted shut. Instead, I pointed to the crate. "Sit." My voice sounded like rocks grinding together. Unused. Harsh. He didn't move, just kept clutching that case to his chest. His knuckles were white. The case itself was made of dark, worn wood, reinforced with brass at the corners. It was clearly old, and clearly precious. I could see the desperate way he held it, a shield against the reality of his situation. "You're safe now," I said. The words felt like a lie. Safety was an illusion, a temporary truce with chaos. I knew that better than anyone. But it was what the regulations would have me say. It was part of the procedure. He finally looked at me. Really looked at me. His eyes focusing. They were a startlingly clear shade of green, like sea glass. "Thank you," he whispered. The tremor in his voice matched the one in his limbs. I needed to restore order, to fit this disruption into a manageable box. First, the practicalities. The cold, the wet. I went to a sea chest against the wall and pulled out a thick wool blanket and a change of clothes. A heavy sweater, thick trousers. My clothes. They would be too big for him. The thought was strangely unsettling. "Get out of those wet things," I ordered, placing the items on the crate. I turned my back, a deliberate gesture to give him a semblance of privacy, but mostly to stop myself from staring. I busied myself with the small stove in the corner, my movements stiff and automatic. Fill the kettle, strike the match, the small rituals that kept the world sane. I could feel his presence behind me, a vortex of cold and dampness and an unfamiliar energy in my static environment. I could hear the rustle of wet fabric, the soft sounds of his chattering teeth. The scent of him began to fill the small space. Not cologne or anything artificial. It was the smell of the ocean, yes, but underneath it, something else. Something human and warm, like rain on dry earth. It was an invasive scent, cutting through the familiar smells of oil, salt, and old stone that defined my existence. It was the scent of life, and it felt like a threat. "Done," he said, his voice still shaky. I turned. He was wrapped in the blanket, my gray wool sweater hanging off his slender frame, the sleeves rolled up multiple times. He looked smaller now, swallowed by the fabric, his bare feet pale against the dark stone floor. His wet clothes lay in a heap, a sad, dark puddle. He had placed the wooden case carefully on the crate beside him. He was an intrusion, a foreign body in the sterile system of my life. My job was to contain the situation, manage the variable until it could be removed. That was the professional line. The personal line was a border I never allowed anyone to cross. He was a piece of wreckage washed ashore, and I was the keeper. Nothing more. The kettle began to whistle, a sharp, clean sound that cut through the tension. I made tea, strong and black, the way I always took it. I poured 2 mugs, the steam rising in the cool air. I didn't own sugar. I handed one to him. His fingers brushed against mine as he took the mug, and the contact was like a jolt of low-voltage electricity. A sudden, unexpected current. His skin was freezing cold. Mine felt like it was burning at the point of contact. An accidental touch. That's all. A meaningless friction of skin, but my mind snagged on it, replaying the sensation. The brief, shocking contrast of temperatures. The texture of his skin. I retreated, putting a physical distance between us, my back against the cool stone wall. I watched him cradle the mug in both hands, bringing it to his lips, the shivering in his body slowly starting to subside as the warmth seeped into him. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was a shared silence, occupied by 2 heartbeats instead of 1. "I'm Elijah," he said, his voice a little stronger now. He looked at me over the rim of the mug, his green eyes searching, expectant. It took me a moment to respond. A name was a key. It unlocked things. I preferred to keep my world locked. "Theodore," I said. The name felt strange on my own tongue, a word I rarely spoke aloud. "Theodore," he repeated, testing the sound of it. He gave a small, weak smile. It was a fragile thing, but it transformed his face, hinting at a warmth I had not seen before. "Your light. I thought I was gone. The engine failed hours ago. The radio was dead. Then I saw your light. It was everything." I said nothing. I just nodded, taking a sip of my tea. The light was a machine, a mechanism of lenses and electricity. It wasn't a symbol. It wasn't hope. It was a tool, doing its job. To imbue it with more was a dangerous sentimentality, a weakness. He followed my gaze up, toward the unseen top of the tower. "How long have you been here?" he asked. The question was personal. It was a probe, seeking a crack in the wall. "Long enough," I answered, my tone flat, discouraging further inquiry. He seemed to get the message. He fell silent again, focusing on his tea. The storm raged outside, a constant, dull roar that was the soundtrack to this strange, unwelcome intimacy. We were 2 people in a stone cylinder, surrounded by a world of water and wind. Trapped. The word echoed in my head. Trapped. He was trapped with me. But the more I felt the magnetic pull of his presence, the unfamiliar weight of his gaze, the more I felt like I was the one trapped with him. Trapped in a space that was suddenly too small, with a feeling that was dangerously large. The storm did not abate. If anything, it intensified through the night. The tower, which had stood against a century of gales, began to feel the strain. A low moan vibrated through the stone, a deep, resonant hum that was more felt than heard. The wind shrieked through the lantern gallery, a sound like something being tortured. We were in the small living quarters one level up from the entrance, a compact, circular room containing a galley, a table bolted to the floor, and two narrow bunks built into the curving wall. It was my entire world, compressed into a single space. And now, he was in it. He had not spoken much since our initial exchange. He seemed to exist in a state of quiet shock, his energy coiled inward. He sat at the small table, his hands still wrapped around the now empty mug, his gaze lost somewhere in the grain of the wood. The wooden case, his strange, constant companion, sat on the floor by his feet. He was a fixed point of stillness in the chaos, and my eyes kept being drawn to him, a compass needle finding its unwanted north. I tried to busy myself with routine. I cleaned the galley, wiping down counters that were already clean. I checked the gauges for the generator, which ran the light now instead of the old clockwork and oil. Everything was nominal. Everything was in its place. Except for him. He was a book left open on a clean desk, a disruption to the perfect order. The economics of intimacy are dictated by proximity. In this tower, we were rich with it. The space was too small to maintain any real distance. When I moved past him to get to the logbook, I could feel the heat radiating from his body, a stark contrast to the damp chill that clung to the stone walls. His scent, that mix of salt, rain, and something uniquely his, was a constant presence in the air I breathed. I was acutely aware of the sound of his breathing, the soft, rhythmic inhale and exhale that was a counterpoint to the howling of the wind. My senses were overloaded. My carefully constructed fortress of sensory deprivation, where the only sounds were the wind and the waves, the only smells were oil and salt, was being breached from the inside. "Is it always like this?" he asked, his voice pulling me from my spiraling thoughts. "The storms?" I asked, my back still to him as I feigned interest in the logbook. "The quiet," he clarified. I turned to face him. He was looking at me, his expression open, curious. It was a look that demanded an honest answer, and honesty was a luxury I could not afford. "It is the nature of the place," I said. "Do you ever get lonely?" The question was a direct hit. It bypassed all my defenses, a perfectly aimed shot, striking the very center of my fortress. Lonely. The word was a ghost I never allowed myself to name. To name it was to give it power, to admit its existence. My life was not lonely. It was solitary. There was a difference. One was a choice, a position of strength. The other was a sickness, a state of lack. "I chose this life," I said, the words coming out colder than I intended. It was a deflection, not an answer. He seemed to recognize it as such. He didn't push. He just gave a small, slow nod, his gaze dropping back to the table. "I think I understand," he said softly. "Sometimes a quiet place is the only thing that makes sense." His understanding was more dangerous than his questions. It suggested a shared territory, a common ground I did not want to exist. I felt a sudden, urgent need to re-establish the boundary between us. He was the survivor, I was the keeper. These were our roles. Simple. Clear. "You should get some sleep," I told him, the command a way of taking back control. "You can take that bunk." I pointed to the one on the right. My bunk. The one I had slept in every night for years. He could have the other one, the guest bunk that had never been used. But the words came out wrong. Or perhaps they came out exactly as some buried part of me intended them to. He looked from the bunk back to me, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. "Where will you sleep?" "I have to monitor the light. I'll stay in the watchroom." It was a lie. The system was automated. I only needed to check it every few hours. But it was a plausible lie, a shield made of duty and professionalism. He hesitated, then slowly stood up. He was still wearing my clothes. The sight was a constant, low-level hum of disruption in my mind. He walked to the bunk and pulled back the rough wool blanket. He paused, looking at the small, confined space. Then he looked back at me. "Thank you, Theodore," he said. His use of my name felt deliberate, an act of intimacy I hadn't consented to. It chipped another piece of stone from my wall. I gave a curt nod and turned to leave, to ascend the stairs to the watchroom just below the lantern. I needed distance. I needed to be alone with the familiar sounds of the machinery, the predictable sweep of the beam. I needed to put the walls back up. "Wait," he said. I stopped, my hand on the cold iron railing of the spiral stairs, but I did not turn around. "My guitar," he said, his voice quiet but clear. Do you think it's all right?" He was talking about the case, of course, the thing he'd clung to like a life raft. "It looks solid," I said, my voice flat. "Probably waterproof." "It's not," he said. "It's old. The seals are worn. It's a Martin from the 1930s. There was a reverence in his voice, a deep and profound love for the object. "I'll bring it up," I said, the offer costing me more than he could ever know. It meant going back into that room, back into the charged space around him. I descended the few steps I had climbed and walked back to the table. I picked up the case. It was heavier than I expected, a solid, dense weight. I carried it over to his bunk and laid it down gently on the floor beside him. As I straightened up, our eyes met, and there it was. The held gaze. It wasn't a challenge, or a question, or a plea. It was something else entirely. It was a moment of pure, unfiltered transmission. The air between us grew thick, heavy, like the moments before a lightning strike. The howl of the storm faded into a distant murmur. The groan of the tower fell silent. All that existed was the space between us, a space filled with a silent, powerful current. In his eyes, I saw not just gratitude, but a profound and aching weariness. A loneliness that mirrored my own so perfectly, it felt like I was looking into a reflection. And he saw me. I felt it. For the first time in years, I felt truly seen. Not as the keeper, not as a function or a uniform, but as a man. He saw past the armor, past the stone walls, and looked directly at the prisoner hiding inside. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I couldn't breathe. The instinct to flee, to turn and run up the stairs was overwhelming. It was a physical force, a command screamed by every nerve in my body. Break it. Look away. End this. But I couldn't. I was caught in the gravity of his gaze, orbiting a sudden, terrifying warmth. The moment stretched, bending time. It felt like seconds, and it felt like an eternity. It was him who broke it, finally. He gave a slow blink, and the current was cut. The sounds of the storm rushed back in, louder than before. "Good night, Theodore," he whispered. I couldn't form a reply. I just turned and walked away, climbing the stairs on legs that felt unsteady. I didn't stop until I was in the watchroom, the small space directly beneath the great turning lens. I stood in the darkness, watching the beams of light slice through the rain-streaked windows, counting the seconds. 1, 2, 3, sweep. 1, 2, 3, darkness. The rhythm I had always found so comforting now felt like the ticking of a clock, counting down to something I didn't understand and didn't want. The fortress had been breached, and the enemy was not the storm outside. It was the quiet, green-eyed man sleeping in my bed, one floor below. The hours that followed were a form of exquisite torment. I tried to lose myself in the familiar sensory inputs of the watchroom. The low hum of the electric motor turning the lens array, the rhythmic clink of the gearing, the way the entire room was bathed in a wave of white light, then plunged into a soft, deep darkness. These were the constants of my universe, but tonight they were just background noise. The main signal, the one my entire being was attuned to, was coming from below. I could feel him there. A weight, a presence, a disturbance in the foundations of my solitude. Every creak of the old tower, every groan of wood or stone, I imagined was him. Turning in his sleep, murmuring a word, breathing. The sound of his breathing, which I could no longer hear, was now imprinted on my auditory memory, a ghost echo playing on a loop. Inhale, exhale. The sound of life. My own body was a traitor. A low thrum of energy, a form of static, seemed to gather just beneath my skin. My hands felt too large, my posture too stiff. I was a containment unit, failing under pressure. I paced the small circular room, my boots echoing on the iron floor plates. From one window, I could see nothing but a maelstrom of black water and white foam. From the other, the same. The world had been erased, leaving only the tower, the storm, and the two of us inside it. An hour passed. Then another. The need to check the generator was a valid excuse, a necessary task. I clung to it like a piece of driftwood. I descended the spiral stairs, my steps deliberately slow and heavy, a warning of my approach. I didn't want to startle him. That was the reason I gave myself. It was a lie. I wanted to see him. I wanted to confirm the reality of his presence, to prove that the memory of that shared gaze hadn't been a hallucination brought on by the storm's oppressive atmosphere. I reached the living quarters and paused at the threshold. The only light was the faint, ambient glow from the emergency pilot light on the stove, casting long, dancing shadows. He was asleep in my bunk, tangled in the wool blanket. He had turned to face the wall, curled in on himself, a posture of self-protection. Even in sleep, he seemed to be bracing against something. His guitar case was on the floor where I had left it. A dark, silent sentinel. I moved as quietly as I could, toward the generator panel on the far wall. The floorboards, which I knew so intimately, betrayed me with a soft groan. He stirred at the sound, murmuring something unintelligible, his body shifting under the blanket. He rolled onto his back. My breath caught in my throat. I froze, half hidden in the shadows. His face, in the faint light, was stripped of the tension and exhaustion it had held earlier. It was younger, more vulnerable. His dark hair was a mess against the rough pillowcase. His lips were slightly parted, and a small, troubled line was etched between his brows. He was not at peace. He had brought his own storm inside with him. I stood there, watching him sleep. For how long, I don't know. It was a profound violation of his privacy, but I couldn't tear myself away. It felt like studying a map of a foreign country, trying to decipher its contours, to understand its hidden landscapes. The facade of the easygoing musician I might have imagined him to be was gone, replaced by this image of deep, troubled rest. This is witnessing. This is seeing the armor fall away. A sense of protectiveness, fierce and unwelcome, rose in my chest. It was an alien emotion. My job was to protect the light, the tower, a machine, an inanimate object. Protecting a person, a fragile, breathing human being, was not in my job description. It was a complication I was utterly unprepared for. I finished my feigned check of the generator panel and turned to leave. As I passed the foot of his bunk, my foot snagged on the corner of his guitar case. I stumbled, my arm flailing out for balance. My hand brushed against his leg through the rough blanket. It was nothing. A fleeting, clumsy contact. Unintentional. Accidental. But the effect was seismic. A tremor shot up my arm, a wave of heat that spread through my entire body. It was an affirmation of his reality, his warmth, his life. The brief friction of my knuckles against the wool, the solidness of the muscle and bone beneath it. It was too much information. My mind, starved for stimulus, fixated on the event, blowing it up into something monumental. He shifted again. A deeper murmur this time, and I recoiled as if burned. I scrambled back, my heart pounding a frantic, panicked rhythm against my ribs. I fled up the stairs, not stopping until I was back in the watchroom, my back pressed against the cold glass of the window, the storm outside a perfect reflection of the chaos inside me. Get a grip, Theodore. The voice in my head was sharp, contemptuous. He is a survivor. Wreckage. You are the keeper. Maintain protocol. But protocol had no section on how to handle the lingering warmth on your skin from an accidental touch. It had no instructions for how to erase the image of a vulnerable face in the dim light. It had no rules for dealing with a loneliness so profound you recognized it instantly in a stranger. The rest of the night was a long, slow battle against my own mind. I tried to focus on the light, the rotation, the mechanics. I stripped down the auxiliary lamp, cleaning parts that were already spotless, my hands needing a task to keep them from trembling. The smell of the lubricating oil was sharp, familiar, grounding. But even it was tainted now, unable to overpower the ghost scent of him that seemed to have permeated the very air of the tower. Push and pull. I would feel the magnetic draw of his presence, the yearning for something I couldn't name. Then I would push back, reinforcing my walls with anger and discipline. He was a disruption. He would be gone in a day or two. The storm would pass. The silence would return to its pure, monolithic state. My world would be mine again. I repeated it like a mantra. He will be gone. He will be gone. But for the first time in my life, the thought of being utterly alone in my tower didn't feel like peace. It felt like a sentence. Dawn did not break. It seeped into the world, a gradual dilution of the darkness into a bruised, featureless gray. The storm had lost its shrieking fury, settling into a deep, guttural roar. The sea was a violent, chaotic landscape of towering waves and deep troughs. There would be no leaving today. Or tomorrow. The realization settled in my stomach like a cold stone. We were prisoners here. I came downstairs to find him awake. He was sitting at the table, staring at his guitar case with an expression of intense concentration, as if he could divine its contents through the wood. He was still wearing my sweater. He looked up as I entered, and the weariness was back in his eyes. Deeper this time. "Morning," he said, his voice husky with sleep. I just grunted in response, moving to the galley to make coffee. The ritual was a comfort, the simple, sequential steps a bulwark against the uncertainty of the day. The smell of the coffee grounds, the gurgle of the percolator. These were my anchors. "I had a dream," he said suddenly, his voice quiet. "I was at the bottom of the ocean. It was completely silent, and I could breathe. I wasn't scared. It was peaceful." I didn't know what to say to that. It was too intimate, too raw. It was a glimpse into his inner world, a place I had no business being. I poured the coffee into 2 mugs, my movements precise, mechanical. "There's no peace down there," I said, my voice rough. "Just pressure and cold." I placed a mug in front of him, avoiding his eyes. He wrapped his hands around it, letting the warmth sink in. "Maybe that's what I meant," he said, so softly I barely heard him. We drank our coffee in silence. The only sounds were the storm and the ticking of the old regulator clock on the wall. A steady, relentless beat, measuring out the seconds of our confinement. I watched his hands. They were long-fingered, elegant, but marred by calluses at the tips. A musician's hands. Hands that created. Mine were thick, scarred, practical. Hands that maintained. We were 2 different species. Finally, he seemed to come to a decision. He took a deep breath and knelt on the floor, laying the guitar case flat. He worked the brass latches, his movements careful, reverent. There was a soft click as the last one opened. He lifted the lid. I found myself holding my breath. The guitar was beautiful. The wood was a deep, rich amber, worn smooth in places from years of being held. The mother-of-pearl inlays on the fretboard were simple, elegant. It looked like an extension of him, something that had shared his life, his history. But there was a problem. A dark stain of moisture had seeped in along the bottom edge of the case, and the wood of the guitar itself was darkened there. Worse, a network of fine cracks radiated from the bridge. The impact against the rocks, or the pressure of the water, had done its damage. A sound escaped his lips. It was not a word. It was a low, wounded noise, a sound of pure despair. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the cracked wood, his fingers tracing the lines of the damage as if he were touching a wound on a person. "No," he whispered. "Oh, no." In that moment, the facade of the weary but resilient survivor crumbled into dust. What I saw was a man completely undone. The loss of this object was the final blow, the one thing he could not endure. This was his vulnerability, laid bare on the floor of my lighthouse. The guitar was not just a thing. It was his voice, his history, his shield, and it was broken. He bowed his head, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He didn't make a sound, but the grief coming off him was a palpable force in the room. It was raw and devastating. And the strangest thing happened. My own rigid control, my carefully constructed armor, didn't just crack. It dissolved. The analytical part of my brain shut down. The part that calculated risk and maintained distance went offline. All that was left was a raw, powerful instinct, the protector instinct. I moved before I had even formed a conscious thought. I crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt in front of him. I put my hand on his shoulder. My hand, which was so used to the cold, unyielding feel of metal and stone, was now in the warm, soft wool of the sweater, feeling the tremor of the man beneath it. The touch was not accidental this time. It was deliberate. It was an anchor. He flinched at the contact, then, incredibly, he leaned into it. Just a fraction of an inch, but it was a yielding, a surrender. He didn't look up. He just kept his head bowed, his grief a private, terrible storm in the shelter of my hand. "It can be fixed," I said. The words were gravelly, uncertain, but they were there. They were an offering. He shook his head, a gesture of complete hopelessness. "Wood and glue," I insisted, my grip on his shoulder firming, grounding him. "Braces, clamps, it's just physics, stress and tension. It can be fixed." I had no idea if it was true. I knew engines and lenses, not delicate instruments. But I was speaking a language of mechanics to try and mend a wound that was emotional. I was trying to impose order on his chaos. He finally looked up at me. His face was a wreck. His green eyes were swimming with unshed tears, his expression one of utter desolation. And in that moment, the roles were completely reversed. He was the one lost at sea, and I was the lighthouse. Not the building, not the machine, but the keeper. The one who offers a steady point in the storm. "Why?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "Why do you care?" The question was the same one he'd asked before. "Do you ever get lonely?" It was a probe, searching for the truth beneath my stoic facade. And this time I couldn't deflect with a cold remark about duty or choice. The evidence of my caring was right there, in the pressure of my hand on his shoulder, in the fact that I was kneeling on the floor with him, sharing his small circle of grief. I didn't have an answer. Or I had an answer so huge and terrifying, I couldn't possibly speak it. An answer that had to do with the silence of my own life, with the reflection I saw in his eyes, with the simple, devastating fact of his presence. So I did the only thing I could. I tightened my grip, a silent, clumsy promise. I'm here. I'm not leaving. And in the quiet space that followed, surrounded by the roar of the Atlantic, something shifted between us. A wall I had spent a lifetime building had been breached, not by a violent assault, but by a quiet moment of shared weakness. I had reached out to steady him, and in doing so, I had lost my own balance completely. I was falling. The day bled away in a series of small, tense movements. I became obsessed with the guitar. It was a tangible problem, a puzzle of wood and tension that I could focus on instead of the intangible, terrifying puzzle of Elijah himself. I cleared the table, laying down a soft cloth. I examined the damage with the intense focus I usually reserved for the lighthouse lens, using a magnifying glass to trace the hairline fractures. Elijah watched me, his initial storm of grief having subsided into a state of hollow-eyed stillness. He sat on one of the bunks, curled up with the wool blanket, observing my every move. He didn't speak, didn't offer advice. He just watched. His gaze was a constant pressure on the back of my neck. It made my hands, usually so steady, feel clumsy and oversized. "I have wood glue," I said, breaking a long silence. "Strong stuff, for boat repairs." I found the small tin in my toolbox, along with a set of delicate clamps I used for electrical work. "And I can make braces from this." I held up a thin piece of mahogany I kept for cabinet repairs. He just nodded, his eyes never leaving my hands as I began to work. The process was slow, painstaking. I carefully worked the glue into the cracks with a fine wire. I fashioned small, precise braces to support the wood from the inside, my fingers surprisingly nimble in the delicate space. It was absurd. I was a lighthouse keeper, a mechanic of heavy, durable things. I was performing microsurgery on the soul of a musician. Every action was freighted with a significance that had nothing to do with wood and glue. I wasn't just fixing an instrument. I was trying to mend the man who owned it. I was trying to prove that things that are broken can be made whole again. It was a desperate act of transference. Hours passed. The only sounds were the storm, the click of my tools, and the soft rhythm of his breathing from the bunk. The forced proximity was no longer just a physical condition. It was an emotional one. We were inside a bubble, a shared space where the outside world ceased to exist. His silence was not empty. It was filled with a watchful, waiting energy. My focus on the guitar was a shield, a way to be near him, to care for him, without having to look at him, without having to confront the terrifying thing that was growing between us. Finally, I clamped the last brace into place. The delicate network of glue and wood was set. Now all it needed was time to cure, to become strong again. "Done," I said, my voice hoarse. I stepped back from the table, looking at my handiwork. It was a clumsy, ugly repair. My makeshift braces were crude against the guitar's elegant curves, but it was solid. It would hold. He slowly uncurled himself from the bunk and walked over to the table. He looked down at the instrument, at the clamps and the visible lines of glue. He reached out a hand, not to touch the guitar, but to touch one of the clamps I had just tightened. His fingers brushed against mine. Another jolt. This time it was not a surprise. It was an inevitability. A spark jumping a rapidly closing gap. He didn't pull his hand away. He just left it there, his fingers resting lightly over mine. The warmth from his skin was a stark contrast to the cold metal of the tool. "No one," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "has ever done something like this for me." I pulled my hand back, the contact too much, too intense. "It was just a repair," I said, retreating to the safety of cold, hard facts. "No," he said, and this time he looked directly at me, his green eyes clear and penetrating. "It wasn't." The unspoken thing between us was now standing in the room, a third presence, vast and undeniable. The pretense of keeper and survivor was gone. The roles of protector and victim were gone. We were just two men in a stone tower, and the air was so thick with tension I could barely draw a breath. The final threshold was in front of us. All it would take was one more step, one word, to cross it. I felt myself backing away, retreating toward the galley, toward the mundane tasks that had always been my salvation. I needed to wash my hands, to scrub away the feeling of his skin, the scent of the wood glue, the intensity of his gaze. I needed to put the walls back up, fast, before they came down for good. He took a step toward me. "Theodore," he said. My name. Again. A key turning in a lock. I stopped, my back to him. I couldn't face him. "Don't," he said. The word was quiet, but it had the force of a physical blow. "Don't what?" I asked, my voice tight. "Don't pull away. Don't go back into the silence." It was a direct challenge, a verbal act that made it impossible to retreat. He was naming my behavior, stripping me of my defenses. He saw my retreat for what it was, not strength, but fear. I turned around slowly. He was standing in the middle of the small room, his hands clenched at his sides. He looked fragile, and yet, in that moment, he was the strongest person I had ever met. He was facing the storm head-on, while I was still trying to hide from it. "What are you scared of?" he asked, his voice gentle, but the question was a razor. "Of this. Of you. Of the way my heart is beating right now. Of the fact that when you leave, the silence you're talking about is going to be 1,000 times louder than it ever was before." I couldn't say any of that. The words were trapped behind a lifetime of solitude. He took another step, closing the distance between us until he was only an arm's length away. I could feel the heat from his body. I could see the faint pulse in his neck. I could smell the wool of my sweater now carrying his scent. "I'm scared too," he confessed, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I've been running for months, from a bad contract, from a bad relationship, from myself. My boat didn't just fail. I think I pointed it out here, into the storm. I was just done. And then I saw your light. His confession was a gift, a staggering act of trust. He was showing me his own broken places, offering his vulnerability as a bridge. Now it was my turn. The final threshold was right at my feet. All I had to do was choose. I could retreat into my fortress. I could make a cold remark, turn my back, and spend the rest of my life polishing the brass of my cage until it shone. Or I could take that one terrifying step across the line. I could choose connection over self-preservation. My entire life, my entire being was screaming at me to choose the cage. It was safe. It was known, but his eyes, his green, sea glass eyes, were offering something else. Not safety, but solace. He saw the conflict in my face. He took one last small step, closing the final inches between us. He was so close now I could feel his breath on my face. "I need you closer," he whispered. It was not a request. It was a plea, a statement of fact, and it shattered the last of my resolve. The choice was made. I surrendered. The words, when they came, felt like they were being torn from my throat, dredged up from a place that had been silent for decades. "The rule book," I began, my voice a broken rasp. "It says, render all possible aid." Elijah watched me, his expression unreadable, waiting. "That's the lie," I confessed. The admission hung in the air, heavy and irrevocable. I wasn't following a rule. I saw you on the rocks, and for the first time in 10 years, I wasn't thinking about the light, or the storm, or the tower. I finally met his gaze, holding it, letting him see everything I had kept hidden. I was just thinking, don't let him be gone. The truth was out. The lie I had used as a shield was dismantled. I stood before him completely unarmed. My fortress walls collapsed into rubble around my feet. The silence that followed was absolute. The storm outside seemed to hold its breath. I felt stripped bare, exposed, waiting for the blow to fall, waiting for him to recoil from the intensity, the raw and desperate need I had just confessed. He didn't recoil. He didn't move at all for a long second. Then he slowly raised his hand and placed it on my chest, right over my heart. His palm was warm, his touch gentle, but it felt like it was burning through my shirt, through my skin, branding me. I could feel my own heart hammering against his hand, a wild, frantic rhythm. "It's okay," he whispered. "I see you, Theodore." And that was it. The final demolition. The last stone of my defenses turning to dust. A sound escaped me, something between a sob and a gasp. My body, which had been held rigid with tension for as long as I could remember, finally gave way. I reached for him. It wasn't a gentle or tentative gesture. It was a desperate, clumsy act of need. I wrapped my arms around him, pulling him against me with a force that was almost violent. I buried my face in the curve of his neck, breathing in his scent, the scent of salt and rain and him. The rough wool of the sweater was coarse against my cheek. I held on to him like a drowning man clings to a piece of wreckage, the only solid thing in a world that had dissolved into chaos. He was slight in my arms, but he felt solid, real. He made a soft sound, a sigh of relief, and his own arms came up to wrap around my back, his hands gripping my shirt. He held on just as tightly. We stood there, in the center of the small room, locked in a fierce, desperate embrace. It wasn't about desire, not in any simple sense. It was about collapse. It was about surrender. It was the catastrophic, beautiful failure of 2 lifetimes of solitude. I felt the tension drain out of me in a great, shuddering wave, leaving me weak, hollowed out. I was shaking, my body finally releasing the years of stored-up fear and loneliness. He held me through it, his presence a steady, grounding force. His cheek was pressed against my temple, his breathing warm against my skin. For the first time, our breathing was in sync. Inhale, exhale. A shared rhythm, a shared life. This was the surrender. Not a defeat, but a homecoming. The collapse of walls, revealing not an empty ruin, but a space where 2 people could finally stand together. We stayed like that for a long time. The only movement, the rise and fall of our chests. The only sound, the fading roar of the storm, and our 2 heartbeats, slowly finding a calmer, steadier rhythm together. The storm broke sometime before the next dawn. The transition was subtle. The wind's tormented shriek softened into a mournful sigh, and the percussive violence of the rain against the glass gentled into a steady, rhythmic drumming. The deep, vibrating groan of the tower ceased. A new silence began to settle, one that was not heavy or pressurized, but soft and empty, like a fresh fall of snow. We had not moved far. Sometime during the night we had migrated from the center of the room to one of the bunks. His bunk, the one that had been mine. We lay facing each other, the narrow space a world of its own. We were not touching, not anymore. But the space between us was no longer a chasm. It was a comfortable, charged stillness, filled with the echo of the night's confessions. I had an arm tucked under my head, and he lay with one hand resting near his face on the pillow. His eyes were closed, but I knew he was not asleep. His breathing was too even, too conscious. I watched him in the pre-dawn gloom. The harsh lines of exhaustion on his face had softened. He looked peaceful. The sight created a painful, swelling sensation in my chest, a feeling so foreign I couldn't put a name to it. It was a mix of profound relief and acute terror. The walls were down. There was nothing left to hide behind. He opened his eyes, as if he could feel my gaze on him. He didn't look startled. He just looked at me, his green eyes dark and deep in the faint light. There were no questions in his gaze, no demands, just a quiet, steady acknowledgement. Here we are. He shifted slightly, and his knee brushed against mine under the blanket. Neither of us pulled away. The small point of contact was an anchor, a confirmation that the previous night had been real. It was a new kind of touch, easy and unburdened by the frantic energy of before. It was a simple, physical fact. The silence stretched, but it was a different language now. It was no longer about what was being withheld, but about what was being shared without the need for words. We had spoken the most important truths already. Anything more would be superfluous. Finally, I spoke, my voice a low rumble in the quiet room. The sea will be calm enough by tomorrow. It was a statement of fact, but it hung in the air like a question. What happens next? Elijah's gaze didn't waver. He considered my words, and I could see the flicker of the outside world returning to his thoughts. The bad contracts, the running, the life he had to return to. A shadow passed over his features. I don't have a boat, he said simply. I'll radio the Coast Guard, I said. The procedure, the protocol. The words tasted like ash in my mouth. The thought of my voice crackling over a radio, bringing the world rushing back to my door to take him away, was physically painful. The idea of the silence returning, this time filled with the memory of him, was unbearable. He held my gaze for a long moment. Then he said, his voice very quiet, very clear, "Don't." The word was a command, a plea, a negotiation. "The supply boat comes in 2 weeks," I heard myself say, the words emerging from some place I didn't know I had. "They can take you back then." 2 weeks. 14 days. A lifetime. An impossibly short eternity. A slow smile spread across his face. It was not the fragile, weak smile I had seen when he first arrived. This one was real. It reached his eyes, crinkling the corners, filling them with a light that rivaled the great lamp upstairs. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated relief. "Okay," he said. Just that one word. Okay. It was an agreement, an acceptance, an unspoken pact. We would figure this out. Together. Here. In the quiet. He closed his eyes again, the smile lingering on his lips. He shifted, turning slightly, and the brief contact between our knees became a longer, more deliberate pressure along our legs. A quiet line of warmth and solidarity. He was not running anymore, and I was no longer alone. I lay there, watching the gray light slowly fill the room, listening to the sound of his soft, even breathing beside me. The great light overhead continued its silent, sweeping rotation, a promise kept to a world that could not see it. For years I had believed that strength was a fortress, an impenetrable wall of solitude and control. But I was wrong. Strength wasn't the wall. It was the terrifying, courageous act of letting the walls crumble. It was found not in the isolation, but in the surrender. It was the quiet, steady warmth of another person breathing beside you in the dark, turning a lonely tower into a home.